You want
All right, we are live.
welcoming people in, and
Yes.
we got a pretty good turnout, Tony. It's I think we had over 400
Wow,
last time we checked.
that's great.
So
Yes.
pretty excited about that.
So here come some folks. We'll just give a minute or two to let folks trickle in, and then we can let the conversation get rolling. While folks are coming in, if you wouldn't mind in the chat function, just telling us who you are and where you're calling in from, that would be great, just to get the conversation rolling. I will start that here. Mandy, thank you. Susan,
Worcester,
awesome.
Ohio, Elmhurst University. Whoa, Pittsburgh, Kansas, Springfield.
Coming
Warren
faster than I
County,
can read them.
Zimbabwe. Yeah, sorry, they're all piling in here. This is great. This is great. Ernie Mahaffey. Hey, Ernie. Glad you could join us. These are going too quickly for me to read as well. Balmy, Wisconsin.
From
Excellent.
Balmy, Wisconsin. Yes, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Sao Paulo. Paulo from Brazil. Welcome. Foot of snow in Denver. Stanley from Northern California. Great. Audrey Chase, my friend from Pennsylvania. Hi, Audrey. Folsom, California. All right. We'll give folks another minute or so to get logged in, settled in.
Gary, do you want to run the kind of housekeeping conversation while we're letting folks roll in?
Yeah, I'm trying to spell Zion de Floride. I don't know where bonjour from. I'm not sure where that is, but welcome. Albuquerque, Rwanda. Excellent, excellent. Ohio Secretary of State Office, Frank LaRose. Welcome. Welcome, Zach. Scott Garrigan. Hey, Scott. Good to see you here. Glad you're here. Got some friends here from Lehigh Valley and the School of Education there, which I'm excited about. So while we're getting started here, while we're just getting started, we'd like this to be an interactive webinar. And so my colleague, Nick Hool, who is here, will assist with the question or the Q&A and the audience interaction. I'd like to start a conversation with Tony, and then we'll have time, plenty of time for audience participation, which we can do via the chat function here.
Yes. Please put any questions you have at any time in the chat. I'll keep note of those and read them out when we're during the Q&A section later on.
Yep.
All right. So things look to be slowing down. So if you guys want to take it away, I'll talk to you soon.
It sounds great. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to stop sharing and let's get started. So, hey, everyone, my name is Gary Schoniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We're the world's leading provider of entrepreneurial mindset education, training, and professional development programs. This is the first in a series of monthly webinars that we're hosting designed to explore the role of entrepreneurship in education. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce our first guest, Dr. Tony Wagner. Tony, thanks for joining us.
Oh, Gary, it's a pleasure. I always enjoy talking with you.
So I'm going to read a little bit of your background, Tony, for those guests who aren't familiar with your work. So as Tony is among the world's leading advocates of education transformation. That's kind of how we connected. A globally recognized expert in education, Tony is currently a senior research fellow at the Learning Policy Institute, founded by Linda Darling Hammond in 2015. Prior to this appointment, Tony held a variety of positions at Harvard University for more than 20 years, including 4 years as an expert in residence at the Harvard Innovation Lab and the founder and co-director for more than a decade of the Change Leadership Group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His previous work experience includes 12 years as a high school teacher, K-8 principal, university professor in teacher education, and founding executive director of Educators for Social Responsibility. In 2021, Tony joined the board of Better World Ed. This is fabulous, Tony. Thanks again for joining us. I want to just start out by talking to, kind of explaining like how you and I connected. And I don't even know if you remember this, but you gave a talk, I think it was in 2012 at the University School in Cleveland, Ohio. You were doing, I think you were on a book tour for Creating Innovators, which is just a fabulous book. I was struck by your message. I was deeply impacted by your message. And I was struck by the resonance, the way that your message was resonating with me. I think we're saying the same things and we're using different language, but that's kind of how we first connected. I think we met later at South by Southwest. I wanted to start by asking you, Tony, just of a brief background, like where are we in the world and why is it important to empower young people to change the world?
Oh, start with an easy one, why don't you?
Right.
Where are we in the world, I think, is a world that is in desperate need of innovation. And I don't mean just high tech. I mean innovation in the third world, in developing countries for better health, for better education, for better welfare, the environment, climate change, critical crises, which are in some ways also opportunities that demand a different kind of mindset, which is exactly what you preach and work on. And I'm using the term innovation and entrepreneurship somewhat together, because all of the innovators whom I have profiled in my book, Creating Innovators, and interviewed since, in fact, are also quite entrepreneurial. They're not synonymous, but what I am suggesting is the entrepreneurial innovator is, I believe, a key aspect of dealing with the global and local challenges that we face everywhere in the world. It's also, I think, a powerful engine for the economy. We can no longer rely, obviously, on many of the kind of traditional ingredients for economic wealth, like extraction of fossil fuels and others. So to me, those are two very compelling issues.
Yeah, Tony, I can't help but wonder, is there some underlying assumption that innovators or entrepreneurs, and we can talk about this sort of this subtle distinction there, but for right now, we'll just sort of use those terms, interchangeably. But do you think there's sort of an underlying assumption of this idea that that's sort of a rare affliction, that it's a dispositional thing, right? That there's some people are just natural innovators and the rest of us are destined to become employees?
Yeah. Well, my view is there's two kinds of innovation. And one kind is about bringing new possibilities to life, think an iPhone or whatever. That's a Steve Jobs, that's a Mark Zuckerberg, that's a Bill Gates. I think those kinds of innovators are rare, and they're much more a matter of nature than nurture. But there's another kind of innovation which is equally as important but doesn't quite get the high profile, and that is the capacity to solve problems creatively. Creative problem solving is increasingly the coin of realm, whether you're in for-profits, nonprofits, or government. And here the good news is, Gary, we are born curious, creative, imaginative. That's the human DNA. The average 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day, and I'm regularly reminded of that with my 4 grandchildren. And not only that, 5-year-olds think of themselves as creative, drawing and coloring and so on are just second nature to them. But then, Gary, something happens. We call it school. Because the longer kids are in school, the less curious they become, the more they become obsessed with getting right answers as opposed to asking good questions, and fewer think of themselves as creative in any way. So I think literally the disposition to be a creative problem solver is schooled out of us in a very kind of heavy-handed and I think largely destructive way.
Yeah, so Tony, that fits with my understanding of creating entrepreneurial students, in that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That we're all born, like you said, creative, curious, and let's not forget the need for autonomy. I mean, what does a 2-year-old say? Like, I do it,
Yeah.
right? That's also a powerful
Yeah.
a need to be autonomous. And I think, and you and I've had this conversation back and forth over the years about the difference between innovators and entrepreneurs. And I think, to my thinking, that the innovation is about problem finding and about problem solving. But the entrepreneurial component is about, to me, in my understanding, Tony, is about the agency and to bring the idea into the world. Like,
That's great.
new ideas don't really sell themselves, so they require somebody to midwife the idea. They need to be brought forth into the world. So that's kind of how I think about it. But I think,
Well, I think that's a wonderful and useful distinction, because there are lots of people who have creative ideas who have had little interest or aptitude for doing anything with those necessarily. But I have to say, I think the younger generation whom I've met are around the world are different, because I think they innovate in part in response to problems they see around them, and they want to make a difference. So that's where I think the entrepreneurial mindset and the innovators' dispositions come together with many of the young people whom I've met. By contrast, you could be an entrepreneur who owns a string of McDonald's, right? And what kind of innovation is that? Bringing bad food to more people?
Well, that's the big challenge that we face, Tony, is that, when we hear the word entrepreneur, we think of someone, we immediately associate it with someone who operates and organizes a business.
Right.
And I'm trying to make the distinction that the attitudes and skills required to operate a business are quite distinct from entrepreneurial attitudes and skills, which are about discovering useful things. The business is about distributing useful things, and the entrepreneurial component is about discovering something useful. And I think that's a big challenge that we all face. So Tony, can you talk a little bit more specifically about what do you think are the specific attitudes and skills that students will need to adapt, not only to adapt and thrive, but I like what you're consistent in that, like, also for like active citizenry.
Absolutely.
It's not just about academics.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying it's not just about academic success or career success. It's about a more fulfilled life and active citizenry.
Well, my view is that for the first time in human history, the skills you need for work, for learning, and for citizenship have converged. They're the same skills. And so, unfortunately, too many people place much too much emphasis on workplace skills and don't talk about skills of citizenship. But hey, you think about the 4 C's. We talk about critical thinking. Need that for work? Of course. Citizenship as well. Collaboration, both places, critically important. Communication skills. And finally, creative problem solving. So all 4 of those, I think, are as important for thriving in the workplace as they are for effective and informed citizenship. But going back to what are some of these dispositions, one way I frame the answer to that question is in terms of the 5 core contradictions between the traditional culture of schooling and the culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. Contradiction number 1 are all the ways in traditional schools that we celebrate and award and measure individual achievement. Well, we all know, innovation and entrepreneurship are team sports. It's I think, a sad misunderstanding that people think of entrepreneurs as working all alone, all by themselves. That's simply not true. You know that better than I. Contradiction number 2 are the ways in which we compartmentalize knowledge in silos, whereas the world of entrepreneurship and innovation demands interdisciplinary approaches. You cannot identify or solve a single problem within the confines of an individual academic discipline. Contradiction 3 is the culture of the classroom. Culture of a classroom in traditional education is often passive, compliant, risk averse. And as we know, entrepreneurship demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes and learn from them. You know, companies talk about fail early, fail often, fail fast, fail cheap, fail smart. You know, that's not what you learn in school, Gary. And,
Right.
you know, entrepreneurship demands that you take initiative, that you question received wisdom, that you question authority. Well, we don't do that in school, do we? Contradiction 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging of all. I've already touched on one. The whole issue of failure and how that has become such a punitive whip in schools. The fear of failure, the horrific bell curve, where the more mistakes you make, the lower down you are in the bell curve. Whereas in entrepreneurship, the more mistakes you make and the quicker you learn from them, the more successful you're going to be. Contradiction 5 is simply about motivation, Gary. I think we rely extremely on carrots and sticks in education to motivate kids. Grades, that's really what they represent, carrots and sticks. Whereas, I don't know about you, but the entrepreneurs and innovators whom I have profiled are much more intrinsically motivated. And we can talk more about where that intrinsic motivation comes from, but it's very different.
Yeah, Tony, I think that you just got right to the heart of the issue right there. I think, you know, I've been working on this thought experiment, and bear with me for a second to try to illustrate what you just said. You know, the teachers, the educators, professors that I meet and work with every day are great people. They're doing their darndest to engage their students in the material. But I'm not sure that you know, sometimes we lose sight of the forces, the undermining forces of the extrinsic reward, the extent to which extrinsic rewards and threat of punishment undermine our innate desire to learn. Right. And so my thought experiment goes like this. I want to see what you think of this, Tony. You know, you're the president of XYZ College, and it's the spring of 2021, and you're speaking to the graduating class of 2023. And your speech goes something like this: boys and girls, today's your lucky day. We're going to hand out your diplomas 2 years early. You don't have to come back in the fall. We think you should come back because there's some really interesting things that you should know.
They're not coming back, are they?
Well, it's a thought experiment, but how many are returning in the fall?
Well, I completely agree with you, but let me suggest the core challenge here that I think faces us. Education thwarts and undermines our innate curiosity. How does it thwart and undermine it? It doesn't give us a chance to ask our own questions, to explore our own interests, to better understand the world around us. Doesn't offer any of those opportunities. And I think this innate curiosity, which is a human drive, is in fact the core of the desire to continue to want to learn. Otherwise, it's all about the incentives, the extrinsic incentives. So the real question becomes, how in education do we continue to nurture and encourage the curiosity that we're born with? And I have some thoughts on that we can talk about later.
Yeah. I you know, I've been reading a lot of Peter Gray's work at Free to Learn, and you know what he reminded me of is that humans are no different than any other mammal, in that we're born with the innate desire and the capacity to learn everything we need to learn to adapt and thrive in our environment, and we don't need to be coerced and manipulated into doing it.
No, we don't.
Right? But we fail to recognize the extent to which other directed, routinized learning systems inhibit that natural curiosity, that natural tendency.
Completely agree. I think
so
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, so I wanted to ask you, how do we shift that because I think that's really the key, Tony. It's the extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And I've heard you talk about this in other lectures. We're still we're still stuck in 1950s behaviorist thinking. Do this and you'll get that. We're still, sort of in the dark ages of this Pavlovian era of motivation, which is, we're still operating on that.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to look at the incentive structure in education in the high stakes accountability environment in which teachers now operate. What are they incented to do? Get high test scores. And most teachers know that's a real dead end. They see when they try to drill their kids and repeat stuff and, quote, remediate, the kids fall asleep. But they feel compelled to do it because their job is on the line. So what if we began, and a lot of folks are already doing this, this is not a what if, this is already happening. We begin with really carefully reassessing what should be the outcomes of, just say, high school for now. What would be an ideal profile of a high school graduate in terms of academic content knowledge, because that still matters, skills, because in the innovation era, skills matter more, and dispositions and motivation, which is what we're talking about now, because motivation matters most. Yeah. So we create a profile, and then we say, that's the target, not the test scores over here. It's this new profile. And in fact, you can go to Profile of a Graduate and learn about all kinds of schools that are doing exactly this. You can get some great resources at my friend Ted Dintersmith's new website, whatschoolscouldbe.org. And there are many steps that are recommended for getting there. But in fact, that is the important first step. You redefine the outcomes that matter most, not in terms of mechanistic one-time test scores that tell us absolutely nothing about work or citizenship readiness. I mean zero, I mean nothing. And instead, define the content knowledge, the skills, and the dispositions that matter most as outcomes in the 21st century.
So, Tony, I think about this a lot. Like, what are the forces that, you said something in a talk that struck me. This is everyone's problem, but it's no one's fault. Right. So we've had this conundrum, like how, where's the immunity to change coming from in our systems of education? Like, what are the forces that are working against this?
Well, I'll identify three. I think the profession of education really selects people who tend to be risk averse, people who love school and basically, that entrepreneurship is as far from their minds as possible. They think most entrepreneurs are greedy and all they care about is money. So that's a cultural problem. I think it's reinforced by the kind of training that educators receive, which is compliant. Graduate schools of education, by and large, are cash cows for the universities who put more money into schools of engineering. There's terrible supervision and mentoring. And finally, the working conditions of educators are that you work alone all day, every day. That's been the problem. But you and I know, isolation is the enemy of improvement. Isolation is the enemy of innovation. One reason I think we have so little innovation in education is because educators are so profoundly isolated. Now, all of that has always existed. Now layer on top of it high stakes testing. And you've got a recipe for, I think, a downward spiral in the American education system.
Yeah, I read a piece the other day about teacher burnout and how that's sort of a convenient word that doesn't really tell you the whole story. They're not just burnt out, they're frustrated because they're not able to do what they came to do. So burnout is sort of a whitewashing. It implies, oh, you're just stressed out, go take it easy. It's
go take a nap, you'll feel better.
Right. But I was go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I stumbled across this concept that Marx wrote about, the worker alienation. And I looked at Gallup's data about what they call the engagement cliff from 5th grade to 12th grade.
Right.
Student engagement plummets from 70% to 34%.
Right.
And interestingly, it's actually in 11th grade, it goes below 34%. It's worse than that, and it comes back up to 34%. And I think that little bump is because people drop out in 11th grade. It's not that they become more engaged. It's just that the data shift. But interestingly, Tony, the workforce engagement matches student engagement.
Sure.
It's about 34%, according to Gallup, in the United States. 34% of workers are actually engaged in their work. Right. So I don't know if that's a coincidence that student engagement in high school is about the same as worker engagement. And Marx talks about, why we become alienated, why routinized, other directed work, we become alienated from what he called our species essence, Gattungswesen. And I got to think of that same thing is happening to the teacher. The teacher engagement has got to be suffering.
Yeah, hugely. And
the
the immediate consequence of that is a growing teacher shortage. The working conditions are horrible, the pay is horrible, the status is horrible. Who today would want to become a teacher?
Right.
Fortunately, there are enough young people who believe it's a way to make a difference, which it is given the right circumstances. But I think we are disincenting teachers for precisely the reasons you described. Their work is alienating. I too have read the early Marx philosophical manuscripts. People don't understand that Marx was a philosopher, a humanist philosopher, way before he was an economist. And he arguably was a better philosopher than an economist. And, he talked about, just as you said, alienation is alienation from self. We think the popular definition of alienation is you're alienated from others, from the rest of the world. No, he said the first alienation that happens is when you do work that has no bearing on who you are as a human being and what you care about. What you lose is yourself. You are alienated from yourself. And I think that's right. In too many working conditions, that's exactly what the case is. It's what happens to kids in school. It's what happens to teachers in school. And we're not giving people opportunities to find and explore their genuine interests.
Yeah. It's also interesting because there's a little passage in his writing, in his earlier writing, that sort of where he contemplates like an entrepreneurial exchange.
Huh.
He doesn't use the word entrepreneurial, but he said, like, imagine a scenario where you and I could exchange something that we created with each other. And I'm paraphrasing here. But he's saying each of us would benefit in two ways. And the first way is that whatever it is that I create, the thing, is a way for me to objectify myself. It's a way for me to manifest who I am. And so I would benefit in that way, but I would also benefit in seeing how the thing that I created benefits you.
Right.
And I think that explains to your earlier comment that helps us understand. You said something a few minutes ago, Tony, that the innovators and entrepreneurs that you encounter, they're all intrinsically motivated. And I think that's really the difference.
Yeah. I think it's key. I think it's absolutely key.
Yeah.
But I think, go ahead.
How do we, what happens if we don't fix this? I'm going to come back to your statement of it's like everyone's problem, but it's no one's responsibility. It's nobody's fault. Let's play this out. What's going to happen? What are the longer term effects of this? We're already seeing them, but.
Well, let's look, first of all, at the very immediate challenges we have. The New York Times today estimated that there are 3 million kids who've had virtually no schooling for a year, none. And very often it's because teachers feel compelled to, quote, cover the material, which means they're doing a lot of the same things they might have done in a classroom, but without the benefit of seeing the kids in person, being able to personally engage with them. Whereas the few teachers who've strayed from the mainstream and have said, okay, kids, for the next X number of weeks, we're going to do projects. And I want you to sort of develop a proposal for something you want to learn more about, something you're curious about. They've seen kids stay engaged, no matter whether they're from disadvantaged families or more affluent families. So I think that's kind of the immediate outcome we have right now is a generation of kids who, will never recover. Economically, right now they estimate at least 10% fewer kids are going to go to any form of post-secondary. And the kids graduating from college without any skills, because this is not a K-12 problem, it's a K-16 problem. The kids graduating from college, 45% of them cannot find a job that has any relationship to anything they've studied, and they have no skills, so they're not basically very employable. I think it's actually higher than 45, but it's the worst job market in many, many decades for our recent college grads. So I think that's the ultimate kind of sad fruit of our schooling system, where kids are alienated from themselves, meaning they have no idea what they're curious about, what they're interested in, what they care about, and schooling does not equip them with the skills they need to make a meaningful contribution, whether it's to start a new company or solve a problem.
Yeah. I live in Cleveland. My wife and I were going to a show or something down at the Case Western Reserve campus. And we were talking with a group, maybe 5 or 6 freshmen, smart, they're all STEM kids. And I asked them, I kind of gave them the Jaime Casap question, like, what problems are you guys interested in solving? And Tony, they just looked at each other like stunned, like they looked back at me like they didn't have an answer to the question.
Yeah, what planet are you from, Gary? They were probably saying.
Right. It was just, it's sort of, it was it was designed to be a provocative question. They just didn't really, no one's ever asked us that.
Yeah.
But I think that's I think that goes back to the earlier, idea of like, how do we shift from an internal to an external locus of control? I just, people aren't really wired to engage in routinized other directed tasks. And I just don't think it's sustainable.
The exciting thing now is that, the industrial era is past. When I began my teaching career, and I write about this in my memoir, Learning by Heart, which you graciously praised, it was the twilight of the industrial era and the beginning of the so-called knowledge economy. The whole idea is that the more knowledge you had, the greater your competitive advantage. Well, taken to extremes, that means everybody should go and get a PhD. And of course, that isn't going to happen because college now has become so obscenely expensive. We're going to see fewer and fewer kids going to even for an undergraduate. But the point is, those eras are both past us now. And today it's the innovation era. The world of innovators and entrepreneurs is the world that most people now see as our present and our future. And it demands fundamentally different dispositions and preparations, but our education system has not in any way adapted to that new world. We're still kind of doing a hybridization of industrial assembly line schooling, fitting people with a knowledge economy that doesn't exist anymore. Because why? The world doesn't care how much our kids know. What the world cares about today is what they can do with what they know, because Google knows everything. So there's no competitive advantage in knowing more than the person next to you. The competitive advantage comes in your willingness to take initiative, to find a problem you're interested in working on and solving. And so these are not outcomes that in any way shape our school systems of today.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point, Tony. I think, my focus is on the entrepreneurial mindset, which is more about the underlying attitudes, right? The deeply held beliefs and tacit assumptions that we've acquired that we don't really know we have, right? And I think you're onto something with your idea that we're still sort of operating on this, 18th century industrial era thinking. And one of the fundamental differences, I think, is in the locus of control, the perceived locus of control. So I define entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And in the creation of value for others, we empower ourselves. And I don't mean empower just economically. I mean, we get access to our full faculties. We become more socially integrated. We more experience better psychological well-being. But I don't, from the moment we set foot in school, it's assumed that we're going to learn in an other-directed learning environment that prepares us to work in an other-directed working environment.
Exactly.
Right? And I think so that's where some of the answers might lie. That, like, to what extent does 20 years of other directed learning create, an external locus of control?
Another thing we learned from Marx is that so much of our culture and our education systems are informed by the nature of work. The first premise of human existence is we work to survive. We have to transform nature to live and survive. But there's now a significant lag time between the changing nature of work, which I've just tried to describe, and the lagging nature of our schooling, which does not prepare people for the 21st century workplace. So I completely agree with you, but what we have now is a misfit and I'm not the only one talking about this. Andreas Schleicher at OECD has been talking about this for a long time all over the world, where there's increasingly a growing chasm between the outcomes of a traditional school, and I mean even very good schools. We're not just talking about schools for poor kids, and the skills needed for work, learning, and citizenship in the 21st century. There's simply no alignment any longer, because we're still kind of in an industrial age / knowledge economy holdover age.
Yeah, that's sort of what you covered in your book, The Skills Gap, right? Sort of the difference between what we're teaching, what kids actually need. So Tony, I want to turn this over to our audience for some questions, and I'm trusting I see there's lots of activity in the chat, so I'm assuming there are going to be some great questions here.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to ask you, I devoured your work, and I said, as I said, I kind of stumbled into you after you had just written Creating Innovators. I also read the book that you co-authored with Ted Dintersmith,
Most likely to succeed.
Most Likely to Succeed, thank you. And that film that you guys co-produced, which is phenomenal, I highly recommend it. We'll put the link to that in all of your work there. So I've been following your work, reading your books, and we also talked a few years back at conference in Austin, which I forgot the name of it now.
South by Southwest.
South by Southwest, thank you. And I was like quite shocked. I remember saying to you, Tony, I hated high school. As an entrepreneur, I felt I found out as an entrepreneur that I actually love to learn.
Right.
And I was stunned when you looked at me and said, "Me too."
Yeah.
And I pre-ordered your book, your most recent book, Learning by Heart: An Unconventional Education, which I really can't recommend enough. And I'm totally being honest with you, it brought me to tears.
Wow.
It really, the generosity in your heart came out. I mean, your whole career in education, but the generosity, your passion, and sort of the underlying reason for your existence sort of emerged in that book for me. And I would recommend this book to anyone who's got kids, anyone that's thinking about going to school, anyone who's in education.
Thank you.
Tell me, Tony, tell us, why did you write that book? What compelled you to write that book?
Two very different things. First of all, I had by that time written 6 argument-based books about education. And at the time, I really didn't feel I had any new arguments to put forward, nothing new to contribute. But I had stories to tell. Mm-hmm. And we know that, we are a story-loving species. And I, all my life, have loved reading memoirs and biographies and fiction. I began my kind of young adulthood thinking I wanted to write novels. And I actually wrote 3 drafts of a novel my first year of my doctoral program at Harvard because I was so bored. And so I've always wanted to do creative writing, and I've always taken creative writing workshops and stuff. And so I decided I really don't have the skills to be a novelist, but I could use the tools of a novelist, storytelling, character development, description, dialogue, in telling my own story, which I thought other people might find helpful. Why? Because I hated school. I was bored out of my mind. I was asked not to return to my middle school for high school. I dropped out of high school in my senior year because of a ruthless, sadistic teacher who humiliated me beyond belief. And then I dropped out of 2 colleges. The first time to write the great American novel, which didn't quite materialize. Wrote a lot of journal entries though. And then the second time to get involved first in the civil rights and then the anti-war movements of the 60s, which was a profound learning experience, as were my times in summer camp that you've no doubt read. So I too discovered, I've always loved learning from the point of view of always reading on my own. Rarely the books that were assigned because I thought teachers kind of ruined them, but I just loved, reading great literature. And that's how I spent my high school career, was reading the good stuff. And then the civil rights movement and then later the anti-war movement gave me a very different set of understandings of the world. And it was the first time I really began to see and understand racism. First time I really began to see and understand our imperialist tendencies in American foreign policy and economic policy. And so I was then, by that time, kind of deeply interested in seeing if I could make a difference. And I thought, well, maybe teaching is a way to do it. Was very influenced by a disciple of Mohandas Gandhi's, whom I met when I was 21, maybe, at an international war resistors conference. And hubristically, I asked if we could have a couple time to talk with him. And he was very gracious and generous. I'll never forget this. He was spinning on a hand-made portable spinning wheel while we talked. And he was spinning cotton. And he was wearing cotton, which some of you may know was the symbol of India's fight for independence, because the first thing they wanted to be independent from were the British textile industries. So they made their own. So the first thing I said is, why do you spin like this? He said, to learn patience. He said, if you're really going to be committed to social change, you have to be very, very patient. And then he said, and these threads, they break all the time. And then I said, well, what's your definition of revolution, Mr. Desai? And mind you, he was a very close associate of Gandhi's. And so I don't know where I got the hubris to ask that. But he said, I'll never forget this. He said, revolution is the dynamic process of transforming individual virtues into social values. I looked around and I thought, where could I do that? And I thought, well, schooling, of course, education. And, I was motivated first by wanting to help kids grow into fuller human beings and to have social values and awareness of the world around them. But I was also motivated because I felt I'd been so profoundly negatively influenced by my own formal education that I wanted to try to become the kind of teacher I wished I'd had. And so the whole second or last third of the book, I guess, is really about my decade of struggle to just become a different kind of high school teacher. And along the way, in retrospect, I realized, in fact, I was an innovator. And also that highly entrepreneurial, because as you know, I worked with others to start Educators for Social Responsibility, and I was their first executive director for 4 years, which required a high degree of entrepreneurship and innovation. So that's the story. A much longer answer than you might have expected, but frankly, it was a project of passion for me. It really was, and I had a wonderful time both writing it and also narrating it, which I do for the audiobook version, which people tell me they
Oh, nice.
really enjoy enormously.
You know, the one thing I kept thinking as I was reading that book, Tony, like thank goodness that you never gave up. I mean, it just sounds like you were getting the hell beat out of you over and over and over
Amen,
again, but
brother.
you kept coming back. And you had so many opportunities to just check out.
Yeah.
And you didn't. And that is really a testament to your spirit and your dedication to this space. And I just think it was such it's a spontaneous act of generosity is how I would describe that.
Well,
book.
that's a very generous response and interpretation. Thank you, Gary. That means a lot to me.
Thank you, Tony. Nick, how are we doing on the Q&A? We're at about 46 minutes. I feel like I could talk to you, Tony, for the next hour.
Well, I have about 3 pages of notes of questions to ask you both.
Wow.
So, single spaced. So yeah, let's get cracking, as they say.
All right.
So the first one I'd love to ask is actually going to be a 2-parter from Dan. Tony, your pursuit of fostering innovation in education has been going on for close to 30 years. There are many others that promote similar ideas. Where are we as a public education system now compared to 30 years ago? And then as a follow-up to that, he said about 20 minutes after asking that question, so it sounds like you're saying in 30 years, not much has changed. So if you could think about that just briefly.
Well, sadly, I think things are for the worse now compared to 30 years ago. And that's mainly because of high-stakes testing. So here's the problem. 2 decades ago, we began to understand that we were not paying sufficient attention to the kids who were not getting well educated, falling behind, because we were not disaggregating the data. And that's bad on us as educators. We were largely unaware. But the consequence was a bipartisan agreement to create a greater accountability and a high-stakes testing environment that subsequently came from that. Well, I think what we're discovering are all the negative consequences of that. We've not closed the achievement gap 1 iota in a quarter of a century of high-stakes testing and increased accountability. It's done nothing for the disadvantaged kids. What it has done for all kids is, as we've described, increased boredom, increased passivity, and diminished teacher creativity. Many of the things that I did and experimented with in both public and independent schools for the decade of the 1970s, I think it would be harder to do today. Now, many people are doing it. I mean, the good news is at the margins, we see a lot of innovation. Charter schools, in schools that are spin-offs within existing school districts that are district charters, have greater freedom to innovate. Many don't do that, but the some that do, like the high-tech highs of the world, are really showing us profoundly better ways of educating and learning. So in a way, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. For the majority of teachers and the majority of schools, there is less and less incentive and opportunity to innovate. But for those who are able to work at the margins, work on these new kinds of startup schools, in fact, there are many more opportunities to innovate and to be creative. So it's a bifurcated world right now.
You know, while Nick, you teed up the next question, Tony, that reminds me of sort of the opening salvo in Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, when he talked about Astro Teller's graph and how the rate of technological advancement is, you know, a power curve. It's a hockey stick, right?
Yeah.
And the human ability to adapt and the institutional ability to adapt is this gradual uphill slope.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just compounding the problem.
Yeah, I certainly agree.
All right, ready
What you
for
got,
another
Nick?
one? Yes. Okay, so this is a 2-parter from Scott. How might we incentivize entrepreneurial thinkers and innovators to pursue careers in education? So not just fostering them, but pursuing the career itself in primary, secondary, and higher education, that is. And how might we measure the ideal profile that you were mentioning earlier, that academic content, skills, and most importantly, dispositions, motivations?
2 great questions. I think as far as motivating people with a more entrepreneurial or innovators mindset, more opportunities to create new schools. And they don't have to be charters. You can create in-district charters, but more startups within education would, I think, both retain some of our great talent right now and attract new talent. Now, obviously, I think the pay incentives need to increase. I mean, the pay for teachers today is totally miserable, and the lack of social respect and regard, I think, is horrible as well. I mean, I look to Finland as a complete contrast to where we are, where teaching is one of the most esteemed professions. And teachers are trained to be scientists, in effect, to be doing continuous R&D, research and development, in their own classrooms and together as teachers. So the more we can sort of create an R&D environment in education, the more successful I think we're going to be at attracting and retaining talent. The second question, the questioner used the term measure. And what I like to suggest is the difference between measuring and assessing. You know, instead of being so data-driven, we have to be more evidence-based. Now, evidence includes data. Data is obviously important. Our dropout rate, our rates of persistence in post-secondary, discipline rates, all of that is data we should attend to very carefully. But data has its limits. It's a snapshot in time. So evidence includes the idea of every student having a digital portfolio. And the evidence like that is best assessed not by a computer, but by collective human judgment informed by that evidence. Not individual human judgment, it's too idiosyncratic, but collective human judgment. That's how you defend a PhD dissertation, right? You don't take a standardized test to get a doctorate. Well, I think a high school diploma should be exactly the same. You should need to present and defend your work regularly, and we show this in our film, Most Likely to Succeed. You should have a body of work that shows progress over time on the skills and dispositions that matter most. And this is not hypothetical. Many schools are already doing this right now today. Many schools, these new startup schools, require students to present and defend work in order to get a diploma. I think a diploma should be a certificate of mastery, not a certificate of seat time served. Just because you're 18 or almost 18, here's your diploma. Doesn't matter what you've actually learned, as opposed to saying, all right, this is going to be like the merit badges in scouting. We're going to have a collection of badges. Entrepreneurship might well be one of them, service learning another. Required badges would include the understanding, showing evidence of understanding the scientific method, communication skills, all of that. And so a high school diploma would be a collection of merit badges, much like scouting. And in fact, I'm a part of something called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, mastery.org, which is doing precisely what I'm describing. They are creating an entirely different kind of high school transcript to send to colleges and employers. One that is mastery-based, not based on seat time served on Carnegie units, not based on GPA or test scores, but based on real evidence. You click on a certification on the diploma, it takes you straight into a student's digital portfolio. So I think that's the future, and that's what we have to work towards.
Yeah, I love that, Tony. I wanted to jump in here just to say that you know, my view of entrepreneurship is encouraging students to figure out how to make themselves useful to other humans outside of a known system.
That's lovely.
And I can't think of a better way to teach, you know, what you would call the 7 critical skills. The better, I can't think of a better way to teach critical thinking than to go out into the unknown with a hypothesis. And by the way, you know, I've studied entrepreneurs in the wild, right? Like on a safari. I've interviewed hundreds of what I call underdog or everyday entrepreneurs. What they're basically doing is following the scientific method, the principles of the scientific method. Right? Yep. They come up with an idea, they test the hypothesis, and they keep testing and tinkering until they find something that works.
But I think a step even prior to that is every entrepreneur I've ever met and every innovator I've ever met asks good questions. And to me, that's the heart of critical thinking. Deborah Meyer writes about the 5 habits of mind, and a wonderful book called The Power of Their Ideas. She was one of the first real entrepreneurs in education, starting a number of high schools, a number of elementary schools and a high school in the 1980s in Harlem. And the power of their ideas describes these 5 habits of mind. First of all, the habit of mind of asking, what's the evidence for this? And they're really, when you look at them, they're habits of question asking. What's the evidence for this? How persuasive is it? What other evidence should we be looking at? First habit of mind. Second is, whose point of view are we hearing this from? You know, or do we know the Native American point of view on American history, or the African American point of view on American history? The third is the question of cause and effect. Is there a relationship here? Is it a correlative relation or a causal relationship? The fourth is all about supposition, supposing that. So what if? And then the last question is all about significance, both personal and social. Who does this matter to and why? Does it matter to me? Why should it matter? So these habits of question asking, in my view, are absolutely foundational for the kinds of things you and I have been talking about for the last hour.
Yeah, fascinating. What you got, Nick?
Ready for more?
Yep.
Several folks are asking some iteration of the same question, which is, how can we start implementing these ideas as soon as possible?
Right.
So rather than going out and starting a charter, which is a great solution down the road, what's something I can do with my class of 50 kids, or maybe you have 120 kids that you see without in a day or a week? What's something you can start doing now?
Right. Well, I'll give you a very specific suggestion, and then I encourage you to visit Ted Dintersmith's website for lots of ideas. But my specific suggestion is simple. Have every student keep a question journal. We're talking about the power of questions, their importance. Get students in the habit of writing down what they're interested in, what makes them curious. And just make a little notebook. I used to do this as I raced around schools all day in my first decade of teaching, kept a note card in my pocket. And every Saturday I'd take my note card down and I'd start journaling. And they were often around the questions, things that were concerned to me or that I was intrigued by. But that's a way of continuing to nurture students' curiosity. So that's the starting point. Then we make time, maybe part of the day of the week, or maybe a week or two at the end of the semester, and we tell students ahead of time, we're going to sit down and we'll ask you to circle the question or the concern or the interest that you really want to explore further. And that becomes the basis for an independent or small group project. And that and again, this has to be credit, no credit. This cannot be for a grade. I even hate the term pass-fail. I want to get the F word completely out of schools. The only failure I recognize is the failure not to show up, not to try at all. Everything else is either exemplary, competent, or not there yet. Needs improvement, incomplete, whatever word you want to say.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
the idea here is that we give kids time to explore their own interests, and even in the most traditional of classrooms, you can eke out, a week or two a semester to do that. And I've seen it done in countless classrooms. For lots more ideas of starting points, go to Ted Dintersmith's website, whatschoolcouldbe.org. There are wonderful videos, short clips that give you ideas for lots of other kind of starting places.
Yeah. Hoping to get Ted on this webinar series.
Oh,
He'd
you
be
should.
Great.
He'd be fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah. Very passionate.
Absolutely. And thank you, Tony. That was a very insightful answer to many of these questions in some way, shape, or form. So that's fabulous. So a couple folks. Oh, Amy asked a good question for Tony. Would you be willing to speak about adult learners in higher education? So we've been talking a lot about the K-12 and traditional higher education pathway, but what about those who are going back into higher education after being out in the workforce? Or
Well, I've had less experience interviewing folks in that context, but I have to believe that the problems, as I mentioned, are K-16 or even K-20 problems. You know, my doctoral program at Harvard was mind-numbing. You know, fortunately, there were comparatively few required courses, but most of the courses that were required were really very, very poorly taught and offered no significant opportunities for real inquiry and dialogue. Fortunately, the good news is most of these courses required a paper instead of a final exam, with one exception, which I'll talk about later. But there, at least, I could choose a topic and write about it. So my advice to people going back to school is be clear about what you're interested in. Be clear about why you're going back and what is it that you want to learn. You know, I went back in part because I wanted a credential that I thought could make a difference. But I also, I had a dream shortly before I decided to apply to return to Harvard for a doctorate. My dream was that I was preparing teachers to reflect on their practice by writing, because by that time I was a writer, and for me, the power of writing, first journaling and then later articles, was the real power of learning. I only really knew something deeply when I wrote about it. So that was my dream, that I was really going to learn the skills to enable me to help teachers be more reflective in their work, and I think therefore more capable. So what's your dream is the question I guess I would ask somebody returning for adult learning. What is it, you know, your question, Gary, which I love, you know, what's the problem you'd like to solve or work on? Or what difference would you like to make in the world? To get a doctorate, you've got to have a very strong intrinsic motivation. Most people who don't get chewed up and spat out by the system. And you got to learn to fight to create your own space. I fought to be able to write the dissertation I really wanted to write. And I, bucked the conventions to do that. But I loved writing my dissertation. I loved researching it. And I did it with the explicit intention that it would be my first book, which in fact it was. So those are, to me, some of the things that might be helpful.
Yeah. Tony, I want to interject for a second. You said I had a dream. In interviewing entrepreneurs, almost to a person, they'll confess some sort of a vision, something that's compelling. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, Tony. I found this quote from Bruce Lee, and he said, "The successful warrior is nothing more than a common man with a laser focus."
Wow.
And I think, the successful entrepreneur is nothing more than an ordinary person with a compelling goal.
Yeah.
Like that's the single distinguishing factor.
Yeah.
That has very little to do with the genetic, her hereditary traits or disposition. It has everything to do with the goal and the impact that goal has on you. Because to your point, if you don't care deeply about the outcome, you're going to give up before you get there.
Yeah, right. It's too difficult. Well, here's a question back at you, Gary. I haven't had a chance all afternoon to explore this. Apropos of what you were saying about a common man with a laser-like focus, let's talk about Steve Jobs for a minute. He had a laser-like focus, and we are, many of us, enjoying the fruits of his incredible entrepreneurship and innovations. But he was also a man who left a trail of tears, paraphrasing a book about the Native American experience. He was not a nice guy to be around. So how do you balance out this laser-like focus with a need to really be much more aware of your impact on the people around you? I think sometimes it is the perception that entrepreneurs aren't necessarily very nice men or women and don't care very much about other people. So I'm wondering how do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tony. And I just learned of this term listening to an interview with you in another podcast yesterday. It's called the Apex Fallacy. Somebody used that term in an interview with you on a podcast, and I stopped it and looked it up. And I said, this is what plagues us in entrepreneurship. It's the belief that, these outliers like Steve Jobs are representative of entrepreneurs, like first and foremost, right? So to be clear, I've been interested in studying the underdogs and the misfits and the ne'er-do-wells and people that have no discernible advantage in life, yet somehow manage to transform nothing into something. How do they do it? So I haven't spent a lot of time like studying the Elon Musk or Richard Branson's or the Steve Jobs of this world. And so I don't really know how to answer your question. I'm more in the realm of the everyday entrepreneur so I really don't, it's a great question. I just don't know how to answer it. Where the literature is interesting here, Tony, that the more resources you have compared to the people around you, like that really starts to skew your understanding of who you are. You start to think that you're better than other people.
I know.
Right? You start to think, like, psychologists did a project where they put like cameras at intersections, and they figured out the more expensive your car is, the less likely you are to pay attention to the traffic signals. Right?
Oof.
And so, but you're, I don't know how to answer your question, but you're raising an important point. Right? How do you stay humble in the face of success, of economic success, right? How do you stay grounded? It is really the question. I don't know the answer to it, but I really appreciate the question.
Well, I don't have any answers, obviously, either. I think part of it, again, comes back to outcomes in school. We don't pay a lot of attention to the extent to which we're graduating people who are really decent human beings, period. Just being a little...
Well, it goes back to your citizen.
We don't develop the capacities for empathy, which I think is absolutely essential in this world, for work and for citizenship. So maybe that's...
Tony, I would argue that empathy is the sort of the tip of the spear for the entrepreneurial minded.
Yeah.
That's a fundamental cognitive shift. Instead of focusing on getting your own needs met, it's a more empathic perspective. What do other people need, and what skills and interests and abilities do I have that I can fulfill those needs? And I think, I have this sort of a Venn diagram, Tony, which is, the intersection of our innate interests, our innate abilities, and the needs of other humans. In the intersection of those three spheres, we become optimally engaged.
Nice.
And I think that's where your work and my work just align so well. That's what we're really interested in. I don't give a rat's ass about how much money somebody made. What I care about is how they impacted their community, their organization, their families, and how they contributed and what they learned about themselves in the process.
I agree.
I don't even
Well, one of the things I love about design thinking is that you begin by embedding yourself like an anthropologist in the culture of the group whom you want to serve, or the individuals and their needs. And you have to absolutely understand empathetically what their needs are before you can embark on a successful design thinking set of solutions. I just think that's a wonderful way of kind of describing what you're talking about.
Yeah. And Tony, I've been saying this a lot lately, like the world, is full of opportunities. It's not that their opportunities are hard to find, it's that they're easy to overlook. Because we've not been trained to think that way. Right? And to your point, like there's 7+ billion people on the planet, and most of them have unarticulated needs. They're not walking around with placards saying, fill this need, fill this need. I mean, you have to sort of be this anthropologist, sort of a detective, to sort of figure out what those needs are. But you're not going to see that if you're only focused on getting your own needs met.
Yeah, completely.
So I agree with you. It's empathy is sort of the linchpin to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Nick?
Great. Okay, I'm going to kind of combine two again, because it's a good callback to some of the things you were just both speaking about. That is, could you tease out more of this overlap between the skills we need for work, learning, and citizenship? And then to piggyback off of that, highlighting those 21st century skills and how those overlap in those three areas as well.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, there is very broad agreement on what we call the 4 C's. And so just taking them one at a time. We were earlier talking about critical thinking. That's one of the first of the 4 C's, which is the ability to ask really good questions. Turns out, while a lot of us as educators talk about problem solving, in fact, what the world wants are people who can identify problems, exactly as Gary was saying. Problem identification, I learned when I interviewed executives for my book, The Global Achievement Gap, begins with asking the right questions, begins with asking good questions. So isn't that equally important for a citizen? I mean, one of the ways we can look at the past 4 years is too few people asked the right questions about behaviors, about, to what extent we were at all focused on science or outcomes, any of these things. We just did not ask because we were not trained as citizens to think critically and ask good questions. Look at the evidence. So the second skill, communication skills, right? And I learned this by interviewing Clay Parker. He said that he was an engineer by training, head of BOAC Edwards, the company that makes the machines that make computer chips. I asked him, what are the most important skills? And he mentioned what I just said, problem identification. I said, what about number 2? He said, well, it does no good if you're adept at problem identification, but you can't talk to anybody. You can't engage anybody. So the second thing I look for is the ability for someone to engage in a thoughtful conversation. It gets back to what Gary was saying about being an anthropologist. And communication skills means as much the ability to listen as it does to speak effectively. Now, we know how important all of that is in the workplace, but look at in citizenship. If you are going to speak up in your community, if you are going to work with others in your community, you have to communicate effectively. So the third skill is the capacity to work collaboratively. Now, we know in the workplace, all work is done collaboratively, except in education, as I was identifying earlier. But, in citizenship, we get nowhere trying to work alone. We have to engage together to solve a problem, whether it's local or national, whether organized politically or whatever it requires. And the last, some people talk about creativity. I prefer the term creative problem solving. Again, in the workplace, that's an obvious competitive advantage. In the world of citizenship, hey, this is what we need. This is where we began our conversation nearly an hour and a half ago. What does the world need today? People who care and want to solve the pressing problems of the world. And that requires creative problem-solving skills. So to me, that's the heart of skills for work, for learning, and for citizenship. Now, you can add a lot of other things. I think, an entrepreneurial mindset is certainly worth considering. I talk about the 7 survival skills in the Global Achievement Gap. You can look those up online if you're interested, where I kind of elaborate on some other skills that I think are critically important. But I'd be very happy with those 4 outcomes if we were to really settle on those for all of our high school graduates.
Tony, I found a paper recently published by Martin Seligman on this emerging field of psychology he calls prospection theory. And I liked that you said, like, I don't want to think of it as creativity because that sort of pushes us over to the dispositional thinking.
Right.
And creative problem solving sort of pushes back against that. But what Seligman and his colleagues put forth in this paper is that when we're actively trying to solve a problem, we get access to unprecedented problem-solving capacities in our brains that are not otherwise available to us when we're engaged in routinized tasks.
Makes sense.
So the compelling nature of the goal actually gives you access to problem solving. And by unprecedented, I mean that, or what he means by unprecedented is that you're not just reaching into your memory. You're coming up with things that are totally novel that have no precedent.
Yeah, talking about
really, really
outside the box, right?
Right. But now there's some.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying now there's neuroscience to sort of,
That's fascinating.
that was exciting to me that, it goes back to the compelling nature of the goal.
But I would suggest that many of these things are like muscles that have to be exercised and developed over time and not just one-shot deals. That's why I want kids to do projects regularly and not just, a senior project at the end of grade 12. That's way too little, way too late. So the idea that we regularly have opportunities to think about problems and we are given license to think out of the box, so to speak, encouraged to do that. And that's one of the things about Google learned about effective teams, is that effective teams have a high degree of relational trust. And what does that mean? It means people are free to propose ideas no matter how seemingly wild or out of the box they might be. They regularly do that. And they provide each other with a kind of the safety that enables people to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Good ideas are the result of lots of bad ideas,
Sure.
right? Well, Nick, you're teeing up the next question. It's like you were talking earlier about, getting rid of the F word. I'm hearing more and more people talk about the way forward is going to be through trial and error, not through expert leadership.
Right.
And I think when you look at what entrepreneurs are doing, Seligman referred to it as error-based learning.
Yeah. Right.
It's micro experimenting until you find the right fit. It actually, like the failure, I don't like that word either because it conjures epic failure.
Yeah.
That's the way forward in ambiguity in the term VUCA, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which
Yes.
is the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Yeah. Ron Heifetz writes about a different kind of leadership. He said, if you have a technical problem, like getting kids to read it by third grade, and that's simply an application of existing expertise. But he argues that more and more problems are what he calls adaptive, not technical, meaning we don't know what the answer is. We have no idea because these are brand new problems. And he said the individual leader who tries to sort of do all of that him or herself is destined to fail. Whereas the adaptive leader really frames the challenge for people and then empowers people to find solutions and gets out of their way, although creating some forms of ultimate accountability. But the point is, the world we live in today requires a completely different kind of leadership. And I believe Ron Heifetz was one of the very first to identify that. I think one of his classic books was called Leadership Without Easy Answers, which kind of says it all.
Yeah, which is, you just made the case for why we need innovators and entrepreneurs in the workplace. What else you got, Nick?
Yeah, I'm going to go a little out of order here and ask one of the most recent questions because it's a topic I think we really need to bring up in the last few minutes here, which is how do we inspire? Well, I'll preface it with saying why I think it's important. That is, a lot of what we're talking about is from the average student perspective, but let's bring in specifically those who may be from a more disadvantaged or with more structural barriers in place, that is Black and Brown students. How do we inspire them to be more innovative and entrepreneurial when many of them, especially from lower income, lower socioeconomic status communities, don't have parents or relatable social models readily available? They may be there, but they may not see them represented.
Great question. I think there's a couple of issues here. I mean, first of all, back up a half a step. There is structural racism, and we have to understand it culturally, socially, economically, and I think have a long overdue set of conversations, both very locally and at higher levels. But having said that, one of the great advantages of a mastery-based education system that I was describing earlier, where a high school diploma is a collection of merit badges, you may get them by 16, it may take you until you're 19, is that it's not time-bound or time-limited. Now, why is that important for disadvantaged families and communities? Because they usually start at least a year or two behind their middle-class counterparts who've had more privileged opportunities, summers, families, all of that. So if you suddenly take away the stigma of needing more time, I mean, think for a moment about how, and this is the way the adult world works. How do you get a driver's license? Is it one and out? You know, you serve 10 hours of driver's ed and then you're magically handed your driver's license? Heck no. It's mastery based. You got to show you know how to park the darn car and drive around a few blocks without running a stop sign. And the world does not care how many times you take that test. How do you get to be a pilot? You know, how do you get to be a physician or a plumber? All mastery based and ungraded. So how many would like to fly with a C- airline pilot? Raise your hands. Somebody who's gotten that takeoff thing pretty good, but the landing, oh no, not so much. No, it's a mastery-based adult world. And the more we move to that for our kids, the more we're going to get rid of some of the structural disadvantages that are built into a time-bound system that basically favors the fast and the furious, so to speak. So to the second point, I began my first 5 years of teaching working with in-school dropouts, kids who I was in a small school within a school that was specifically started as an alternative program. And one of the things I learned early on is that very often the way to reach the most seemingly unmotivated kids is to keep asking the question, what are you interested in? Versus remediation, which is, I think, a dirty word. So often, you know, when we're working with disadvantaged kids, we go through it a second time, we speak louder and we speak slower. And we cover the same material. And the kids are bored out of their minds. And we wonder why they want to drop out of school. Well, you know, if I think intrinsic motivation, that spark, is what we need to identify and nurture to enable more kids to succeed in more skills. And I know that from my own personal high school teaching experience, which I relate to in my book. So
I want to jump.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, good.
Andrew Fody is asking an interesting question here I wanted to address, Nick. Will you be dealing with the question as to what steps need to be taken to change the culture of educational institutions other than simply starting a charter school? Tony, I'll give you a second to address that but I wanted to jump in and say, Andrew, it's part of what we do in our work is we spend a lot of time training teachers. We've trained thousands of educators from around the world how to cultivate entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills in the classroom. But the point I wanted to make is that we see this as a way of empowering the teacher as sort of a Trojan horse, sort of a probiotic way to bring about change, to give the teacher some skills that he or she can deploy in the classroom in spite of the system. That's a big part of what we do. Thank you for the question. Tony, you got something on that?
Great question. I really believe we have to transform teacher preparation as well as in-service programs. In-service programs, at the risk of a slightly kind of off-color description, they're sometimes referred to by teachers as swoop and poop, one and done. And they don't work. We know that. You know, you've got to have a clear focus and a clear set of priorities, and you persist over time to develop teacher capacity and efficacy. We know from the work in Finland that began 40 years ago that if you really transform the preparation of teachers, you transform the classroom. Period. Done. Finland has the best education system in the world. There is the least gap between advantaged and disadvantaged kids, less than 4%. Oh, and by the way, it isn't all lily white over there. There are 45 languages currently spoken in Helsinki schools. So I highly recommend my friend Pasi Sahlberg's book, Finnish Lessons. The new version, 3.0, is just out, to better understand how you differently prepare educators for a very different kind of education system.
Awesome. Nick, we're running out of time here. We got time for another question or two. Got about 5 minutes left.
Yes. Let me find a good juicy one to end things on. So let's talk a little bit more about. Well, you guys already kind of talked about that one. Fostering entrepreneurship and innovation in schools as we stand. That's kind of where you were going with your comments just a moment ago, both of you. Okay. Yash asked an interesting question. Can you talk more about the project motivation research that you had mentioned earlier, Tony? That is, and that's kind of tying into our work at Eli as well. Project-based learning, peer-to-peer learning, things of that nature. Can talk about those sorts of things that are practices we already see going on in the classroom.
Well, again, Ted Dintersmith's collection of short videos does a wonderful job of documenting many of these. But the core idea is what we've been talking about for the last hour and a half, which is really stimulating intrinsic motivation. When kids get to choose their own projects, choose problems they're interested in learning about, they are then motivated to develop both the knowledge and the skills they need. You know, some people talk about our current education system as a just-in-case education system. Well, we're going to teach you calculus just in case you might need it someday, and no, none of us ever will. But we'll teach it just in case anyway. Contrast that with the just-in-time approach, where you're working on a problem or a project, and just in time, you're going to go back and with help and mentoring and coaching from teachers and others, you're going to learn the content knowledge and learn the skills that you need to solve the problem or answer the big question you're interested in. By the way, it isn't just all project-based learning. Inquiry learning, Socratic dialogues, there are many different ways of stimulating intrinsic motivation. And I always worry in education when we identify one trend, one fad as the silver bullet that's going to transform all of our classrooms. So the real issue here is all of the ways in which we can nurture, stimulate, and encourage the intrinsic motivation that we're all born with. Let's not forget that.
That's right. That's right. And we'll end on that note, Tony. I think, as I think about and observe entrepreneurs, I would say that entrepreneurial learning is natural learning. They're learning, they're following their own interests. They're learning much the ways we probably learned thousands of years ago, right? It's inquiry-based learning, it's social learning, it's trial and error experimentation, problem-based learning. But anyway, I digress. Tony, I just want to say thank you again for joining us for this webinar. It's been a fascinating conversation. Where can folks connect with you?
Well, I'm pretty regular on Twitter at Dr. Tony Wagner. I never tweet about things I've had for breakfast. Instead, I tweet interesting articles and research that I think may be relevant and useful to people. Like the article I mentioned in the Times this morning about how many people we've left behind in our education was my most recent. I also have a website, tonywagner.com. Where you can see some of my other keynotes and information about all 7 of my books now, and where and how you can order any one of those. So those are probably the 2 best ways to keep in touch.
Excellent, excellent. Tony, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. Lots of good stuff here. Thank you.
Gary, it's just been a pleasure. You've stimulated me to think about lots of things related to entrepreneurship that I haven't thought about in a while, and you've taught me things, so I'm grateful for the conversation as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. I just want to wrap up now with some final thoughts here. Let me find my slide here. Can you see this slide over?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. So, I hope you guys have enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you'll join us next month for a conversation with Duncan Smith. Duncan is the Chief Library Strategist at EBSCO, which is a multinational corporation that supplies content to libraries. He's going to talk about the role that libraries are are now undertaking to cultivate entrepreneurship in communities. So I hope you'll join us for that next month. That'll be March 24th at 1 p.m. If you want to learn more about our work, we have a monthly webinar that just delves into more about our work. We call it the Entrepreneurial Mindset Education 101 webinars. The next one is Tuesday, March 16th at 2 o'clock. Hope you can join us for that. You can find more about our work at elimindset.com. So again, everyone, thanks for joining us and hope to see you here on the next webinar.
Thank you, Tony.
Bye, guys.
Great job, guys.
Thanks again, Tony.
I'm kind of exhausted
you.
and wrung out, but in a good way. It was great.
Yes.
Awesome.
Well done.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Gary. Thanks again. It was great to be in touch.
Yes. Thank you, Tony. We'll talk soon.
All right.